Right now, all this function does is return the symbol for yen. However, are we ever going to use this symbol without an amount of currency following it like we have over here? Are we ever just going to print the yen symbol without any money? We might, but for a moment let's pretend we're not. So instead of forcing the main program to always add the value to print alongside that symbol itself, why don't we instead make this function simply return the string version of the amount of currency preceded by the symbol for yen? In other words, instead of having this function return the symbol for yen and then have to print the number 5 separately, why don't we instead put the number 5 into that function and have it return the entire string? Well, to do that, we need to send in the amount of currency to use as input into the function. So here we've updated the function definition and put some new information in the header. On line 2 that defines the function, we're still defining a function, and the function's new name is return yen amount. But instead of an empty open and close parentheses after that, there's now something inside the parentheses, the variable name amount. Notice that it appears in blue, which indicates that it's a variable. Amount is what we call a parameter of this function. It's like creating a variable specifically for this function. Inside the function body, we can refer to amount as a variable. The value for this variable is the argument passed into the function when it's called. So as this code runs, it initially skips lines 3 and 4 because they're inside the function body, and then it gets to line 7. Line 7 says to print the output of the function called return yen amount. But instead of just an open and closed parentheses at the end, there's now a value inside, the number 5. When this function is called with something inside the parentheses, whatever is inside the parentheses gets loaded into the variable name from our function definition. So when we call return yen amount with the argument 5 with 5 in the parentheses, then the function return yen amount gets run with 5 as the value for the variable amount. It's just as if we started this function by saying amount equals 5. In fact, that's exactly how you can think of parameters and arguments as working. The very first thing that happens when a function is called is that the computer runs an assignment statement with each variable and the corresponding value, or each parameter and the corresponding argument. So here, calling return yen amount would jump execution of this program to the function. The computer would set amount equal to 5, and then it would run the body of that function. The body simply says to return the symbol for yen as a string, plus, or concatenated, or putting two strings together, the string version of whatever was put in as the amount. String is a function, and so it calls string 5, and that leads to the output of a string containing the character for 5. Just like with the functions we write, this function call is now basically replaced by that output. This function returns a string version of that argument. So we've actually been using parameters and functions and arguments throughout, it's just now we're defining the vocabulary around them. After that gets done, this basically says to return a string containing the symbol for yen plus a string containing number 5, which equals a single string containing both. That becomes our output and goes back and replaces the original function call. So this line ultimately just says to print the string with the symbol for yen followed by the number 5. And sure enough, that's what we see happening. Now so far, we've been using actual values as our arguments. We use the number 5. In general though, usually you'll see actual variables used as arguments, in which case the value of the variable becomes the value of the parameter inside the function. Here's a good example of this. Instead of just assuming that we want to use the number 5 as the input into our function, we're instead going to get some user input. We're going to ask the user to enter the amount that they want to put next to the symbol for yen. In this particular execution of the program, the user actually enters 5 again. So once again, this code runs, defines the function or loads it into short-term memory, skips the body for now because the function hasn't been called yet, and then on line 6, it gets some user input. The function call, starting from the inside, we call the function input with the argument enter the amount. We've done this before, but now we're describing it in terms of function calls and arguments. That prints the text enter the amount and waits for the user to enter something. In this case, the user enters the number 5. The way this function is written, it now returns a string of whatever the user entered. And so just as before, this function call is replaced with a string for 5. That then becomes the argument for the function that converts to an integer, which is then itself replaced by the actual integer 5. So 5 then becomes the value for input amount. So after all this runs, we have a variable named input amount with a value of the integer 5. When line 8 runs, it's told to print the output of the function called return yen amount using the argument input amount. So the first thing it does is it takes the value of input amount and replaces the variable name with that value. So now it's as if input amount just said 5. And now our code is exactly the same as it was before. Return yen amount with the integer 5 as the argument. We'll put 5 in as the value for the variable amount. Execution will jump to the function because we're doing a function call, and it will run lines 3 and 4. Line 4 returns a string containing the symbol for yen and whatever number was passed in as an argument. In this case, the number 5 again. After all that's done, this entire function call will be replaced by whatever its output was, which once again is a string containing the symbol for yen and the number 5. So then the computer basically runs print that string, and again, that's our output. So the important takeaway here is if we use a variable as an argument, then the value of that variable gets loaded into the parameter of that function. We used the variable input amount as our argument. Input amount had a value of 5, and so amount in the function gets the value 5.